Christopher Columbus was born into the salt-stained world of Genoa, a city that lived and breathed by the sea. In the mid-15th century, its docks were a loud classroom, ropes snapping under strain, merchants shouting prices in half a dozen tongues, sailors swapping stories that mixed truth with superstition. Columbus grew up watching ships leave for horizons that might never return them, and that daily gamble shaped him early. Genoa did not teach romance about the ocean. It taught arithmetic, risk, profit, loss, and it taught that a man without land could still build a life by mastering wind and distance. Columbus's family life pushed him toward practical work rather than noble dreams. Genoa was full of craftsmen, traders, and small entrepreneurs who survived by staying useful, and the young Columbus learned to be useful fast. Even before he had any official command, he was absorbing the invisible skills that decide who lives at sea, reading clouds, respecting currents, understanding how quickly weather can turn a routine voyage into a funeral. He wasn't raised in a court with maps laid out like trophies. He was raised in a port where mistakes were paid in blood and salt water. His first maritime steps were likely modest, but they were relentless. He moved from the safe edges of coastal sailing into routes where the sea stopped forgiving. Every voyage added a new layer to his mind. How to manage men who were tired and scared. How to keep accounts in a world where cargo could vanish in a storm. How to memorize coastlines by the shape of mountains and the smell of land on the wind. He learned that a ship is not just wood and canvas, it is discipline, routine, and nerves held together by trust in a captain's voice. As he matured, Columbus began drifting beyond Genoa's immediate orbit, following the wider web of Mediterranean trade. This is where his education stopped being local and became strategic. In busy ports, he would have heard arguments about routes and rival powers, about who controlled straits and who taxed the sea lanes, about which harbours were safe and which were traps. He was not merely travelling, he was collecting a map inside his head made of experiences, prices, dangers, and opportunities. An internal chart far more persuasive than any parchment. With every new distance, he developed the kind of confidence that can be either genius or danger. He saw that the sea rewarded those who could endure long stretches of uncertainty, and he started to trust his own judgment over the cautious instincts of others. The ocean trained him to think in bold lines. If a problem could be solved by waiting, a sailor waited. If it could be solved by moving, a sailor moved. That habit of decision, choosing direction and committing to it, became part of his character long before he ever tried to convince anyone to fund a grand venture. By the time his maritime beginnings had hardened into a career, Columbus was no longer just a Genoese seaman looking for the next wage. He had become the product of a port city's harsh logic: learn fast, adapt faster, and never confuse comfort with safety. The sea had taught him endurance, but it also taught him something more volatile: belief. Belief that wind could be predicted, that distance could be measured, that fortune could be forced to open its hand. And once that belief took root, it was only a matter of time before he began looking past the familiar routes and imagining a passage that others dismissed as impossible. The idea did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow pressure building in Columbus's mind. Every familiar route to Asia was already crowded, controlled, taxed, or contested by rival powers. Merchants spoke of spices and silk as distant miracles, yet the paths to reach them ran through hostile empires and dangerous choke points. Columbus began to wonder whether the real problem was not distance, but direction. If the known roads were blocked, perhaps the answer lay in ignoring them entirely. He understood that the Earth was round. This was not radical, but he underestimated its size in a way that made his vision plausible to himself. Drawing on selective readings, traveller's tales, and optimistic calculations, he convinced himself that Asia lay far closer across the Western Ocean than most scholars believed. This was not ignorance so much as choice. Columbus gravitated toward figures and theories that confirmed what he wanted to attempt, filtering doubt out of his arithmetic and replacing it with confidence. The westward route promised more than geography. It promised independence. A sailor who reached Asia by sailing west would bypass established trade networks and the powers that guarded them. There would be no need to negotiate with Eastern empires or Mediterranean rivals. Whoever financed such a voyage would gain direct access to wealth, prestige, and leverage. Columbus framed his dream not as exploration, but as efficiency. Shorter distances, faster profits, fewer intermediaries. Yet the ocean he proposed to cross was not an abstract space on a map. It was an unknown expanse that terrified experienced mariners. Beyond the known islands lay weeks, perhaps months, of open water with no guarantee of land. Ships could rot, crews could mutiny, and navigation errors could mean vanishing without a trace. Columbus dismissed these fears not by disproving them, but by refusing to dwell on them. He trusted endurance over caution, momentum over hesitation. As the dream hardened, it became inseparable from his identity. The westward route was no longer merely an idea, it was proof that he understood the world better than those who doubted him. Each rejection by experts and officials reinforced his belief that innovation always looked foolish before it succeeded. Opposition became fuel. If so many dismissed the plan, then success would belong entirely to the one who dared to insist. By the time Columbus began presenting his proposal to European courts, the dream had acquired moral weight in his own mind. He spoke of opportunity, of faith, of destiny, blending commerce with conviction. Sailing west to reach Asia was not just a navigational shortcut. It was a challenge to accepted limits. And once that challenge was articulated, retreat became impossible. To abandon the idea would have meant admitting that the ocean, not his vision, had the final word. And Columbus was never prepared to accept that. Columbus did not imagine the westward route in isolation. His thinking was shaped by a world of maps that blended measurement with belief. Late medieval charts were not neutral tools, but arguments about how the world worked. Coastlines faded into blank space. Islands appeared and vanished, depending on the cartographer, and scale bent to expectation, rather than precision. Columbus studied these maps closely, not for what they proved, but for what they allowed him to believe. Where others saw uncertainty, he saw possibility. Classical geography offered him intellectual legitimacy. Ancient authors described a globe where land outweighed water, where the inhabited world stretched confidently across the northern hemisphere. Columbus leaned heavily on these authorities, treating them less as historical voices and more as witnesses in his case. He accepted their conclusions while ignoring the centuries of new observation that complicated them. Antiquity, in his mind, carried a purity that later corrections seemed to dilute rather than improve. Myths filled the gaps that measurement could not. Sailors spoke of islands that appeared only to the faithful, of lands glimpsed on the horizon and never reached again. Stories of Antillia and other phantom lands circulated widely, and Columbus did not dismiss them outright. Instead, he treated myth as rumour waiting for confirmation. If such islands existed, they could serve as stepping stones across the ocean, breaking the journey into survivable stages. travel literature reinforced this selective worldview. Accounts attributed to Eastern travelers described Asia as vast, wealthy, and densely populated, filled with cities that shimmered with gold and spice. Columbus absorbed these descriptions eagerly, imagining that a Western approach would strike the edge of this abundance. Distance shrank in his mind as richness expanded. The more valuable the destination became, the more reasonable the risk appeared. What mattered most was not whether these sources agreed with one another, but that together they formed a coherent narrative. Maps suggested proximity, classical texts implied feasibility, and myths softened the terror of the unknown. Each source reinforced the others, creating a closed system of belief that resisted contradiction. Columbus was not deceived by a single error. He was persuaded by the harmony of many partial truths. For years, Columbus carried his proposal from court to court, like an unwanted burden. He arrived with charts, calculations, and an unshakable certainty, only to be met with polite distance or outright dismissal. European rulers were not hostile to exploration, but they were cautious with resources, and Columbus asked for a great deal. Ships, crews, and royal backing were expensive, and failure at sea meant not just financial loss, but political embarrassment. Most courts preferred proven routes over speculative horizons. The objections he faced were often practical rather than theoretical. Advisors questioned his estimates, pointing out that the ocean to the west was far wider than he claimed. They warned that ships would run out of food and water long before reaching land. Columbus responded by repeating his calculations with greater confidence, not greater accuracy. Each rejection sharpened his resolve rather than correcting his assumptions. In Portugal, where maritime knowledge was advanced and oceanic exploration was already underway, his ideas were examined closely and then set aside. The Portuguese crown had invested heavily in routes around Africa and saw no reason to gamble on an untested alternative. To them, Columbus appeared stubborn and unreliable, a man who refused to adjust his figures when challenged. When Portugal declined, it marked a turning point, proof that expertise did not guarantee support. Moving through Spain, Columbus encountered a court consumed by war and consolidation. The monarchs were focused on securing territory and stabilizing power, not chasing uncertain profits across an empty ocean. Committees listened, debated, and postponed decisions. Years passed in waiting rooms and corridors as Columbus lived in financial insecurity, dependent on minor patrons and temporary favors. His dream survived, but his position weakened. Rejection took a personal toll. Columbus began to frame opposition as blindness rather than caution, convincing himself that he alone possessed the clarity to see what others could not. Each refusal reinforced the narrative that great ideas were always misunderstood at first. Doubt became external, never internal. The longer he was denied, the more the westward route felt like a test of destiny, rather than a proposal open to revision. Support did not come suddenly, nor did it arrive out of enthusiasm for Columbus himself. It emerged from a moment of transition in Spain, when old conflicts were closing and new ambitions were searching for direction. As the long war on the Iberian Peninsula drew to an end, the monarchy found itself with experienced soldiers, restless nobles, and a treasury strained but intact. Victory created momentum, and momentum demanded a new outlet. Columbus re-entered the Spanish court at precisely this point of change. His proposal had not become more convincing, but the political environment around it had shifted. What once sounded like a reckless distraction now resembled an opportunity to extend influence without reopening war. A westward voyage promised potential wealth, prestige, and spiritual expansion, all without immediate confrontation with rival powers already entrenched along eastern routes. The negotiations were difficult and prolonged. Columbus demanded titles, privileges, and a share of future profits that many advisors considered excessive. He insisted not as a petitioner, but as a man convinced of the scale of what he would deliver. Rather than weakening his stance, years of rejection had sharpened it. He no longer asked to serve. He demanded to be rewarded in advance for success he considered inevitable. Religious ambition played a crucial role in reshaping his proposal. Columbus framed the voyage as more than trade or discovery. He spoke of spreading the faith, of reaching distant peoples untouched by Christianity, and of gathering resources that could support future holy campaigns. This language aligned his personal ambition with the monarchy's broader vision, transforming a private gamble into a mission that appeared both righteous and strategic. Even so, approval came hesitantly. Advisors debated costs, risks, and the likelihood of failure. The final decision was not born of certainty, but of calculation. The ships required were few, the crews modest, and the potential loss manageable. If Columbus failed, the damage would be limited. If he succeeded, the rewards could be immense. It was a wager taken not because the odds were favourable, but because the possible return outweighed the risk. The voyage began not with triumph, but with uncertainty carefully hidden behind ceremony. 3 small ships slipped away from familiar shores, carrying expectations far heavier than their hulls. Columbus projected confidence, yet the ocean ahead offered no confirmation that his calculations were sound. Every mile west erased the last traces of known geography, replacing certainty with routine, prayer, and disciplined optimism. The sea was calm, but calm did not mean reassuring. Days turned into weeks, and the horizon refused to change. The crews measured progress not by distance, but by endurance, watching supplies shrink while the water remained endless. Columbus managed morale with controlled information, adjusting recorded distances to soften the truth. Leadership at sea meant shaping perception as much as steering a course. He understood that fear spreads faster than hunger, and once it took hold, command could dissolve in a single night. As the ships pressed on, signs began to appear: floating vegetation, shifting birds, changes in the colour of the water. Each hint was seized upon as proof that land lay close, even when it might have meant nothing at all. Columbus interpreted these signals decisively, reinforcing his authority by transforming ambiguity into direction. Doubt remained, but it was no longer directionless. It was aimed forward. Tension reached its peak when patience began to fail. The men had crossed farther than any of them believed safe, and whispers of turning back surfaced openly. Columbus responded not with threats, but with promises measured in days rather than miles. He tied the success of the voyage to imminent reward, narrowing the future until retreat seemed premature. Leadership became an act of compression, reducing an infinite ocean into a manageable weight. Land finally appeared not as a revelation, but as relief. The first sighting broke the spell of endless water, transforming exhaustion into celebration almost instantly. Columbus stepped ashore, convinced he had reached the edge of Asia, interpreting what he saw through the lens he had carried across the ocean. The reality before him was filtered through expectation, named and claimed according to a vision formed long before the voyage began. the first crossing ended without clarity, but with conviction intact. Columbus had not proven his geography, yet he had proven that the ocean could be crossed and returned from alive. That alone altered the balance of belief. What had been theoretical became possible, and possibility invited repetition. The voyage closed one question while opening many more, setting in motion consequences far larger than the fragile ships that first carried the dream westward. Landfall came quietly, without the grandeur Columbus had imagined. The shoreline was green, warm, and unfamiliar, offering no cities, no harbours, no signs of the empires he believed were near. Yet he stepped onto the sand with certainty, claiming the land through ritual and language that imposed meaning before understanding could form. What mattered was not what the island was, but what it could be made to represent. The first encounters unfolded in an atmosphere of cautious curiosity. The island's inhabitants approached without visible fear, observing the newcomers with the same interest they themselves inspired. Columbus noted their appearance, their tools, their gestures, filtering everything through comparison rather than comprehension. He saw difference, but he interpreted it as simplicity, and simplicity as opportunity. From the beginning, judgment preceded knowledge. Communication relied on signs, guesses, and assumptions. Objects were exchanged, small ornaments for unfamiliar materials, each side attaching its own value to the trade. Columbus interpreted generosity as submission and openness as weakness, mistaking hospitality for readiness to yield. He searched constantly for confirmation of wealth, asking about gold with gestures that revealed more about his priorities than his questions. As days passed, exploration replaced arrival. Columbus moved along the islands convinced that greater prizes lay just beyond the next horizon. Each new shore was measured against expectation, and when it failed to match his vision of Asia, it was treated as incomplete rather than different. Geography bent again under belief, reshaped to preserve the logic that had carried him across the ocean. The encounters were peaceful, but the imbalance was already present. Columbus observed that the islanders lacked weapons he recognized, and concluded they would be easily governed. This assumption hardened quickly into strategy. He began thinking not in terms of meeting new peoples, but of organizing them within a system of extraction and control that mirrored familiar European hierarchies. Columbus did not arrive in confusion. He arrived with a conclusion already formed. Long before he stepped ashore, he had decided where he was going, and the land he found was forced to fit that destination. His belief in reaching Asia was not the result of discovery, but of expectation. Every observation was filtered through a framework he had carried across the ocean, one that left little room for alternative explanations. Geography, as Columbus understood it, supported his certainty. He believed Asia extended far eastward, broken into islands that lay scattered near its edges. The islands of the Caribbean, with their warm climate and lush vegetation, seemed to match classical descriptions of the outer reaches of the East. Rather than question his maps, he treated unfamiliar coastlines as fragments of a known world whose centre simply lay farther on. Cultural differences reinforced rather than challenged his assumptions. The people he encountered did not resemble the merchants and rulers described in travel accounts. But Columbus interpreted this as a matter of location, not error. These, he reasoned, were island peoples living on the margins of Asia, distant from its wealthy courts. Difference became confirmation, proof that he had reached the periphery rather than the heart of the world he sought. Language also played a decisive role. Columbus searched for familiar names and concepts, assigning labels drawn from classical and medieval sources. He asked about rulers he expected to exist, places he believed were nearby, and riches he assumed lay inland. When answers failed to align, he interpreted silence or misunderstanding as evasiveness rather than contradiction. Communication gaps protected his certainty. Gold, or the promise of it, further anchored his belief. Small ornaments and traces of precious metal were treated as signs of larger sources yet to be found. Columbus interpreted scarcity as distance rather than absence, convincing himself that he stood only a short journey from great Asian markets. The logic was circular but powerful. He expected wealth, found hints of it, and treated those hints as proof of proximity. Even when evidence accumulated against him, Columbus refused to reconsider. To admit error would have meant unravelling the logic that justified the voyage itself. His authority, his rewards, and his identity were bound to the claim that Asia had been reached. Belief became defence. In that moment, geography was less important than coherence, and Columbus chose a world that confirmed his vision over one that demanded revision. The return voyage transformed uncertainty into spectacle. Columbus sailed back not as a navigator seeking answers, but as a man carrying proof, objects, captives, and stories shaped to fit expectation. The crossing eastward was framed as confirmation rather than conclusion, each day reinforcing the narrative that the ocean had yielded to intention. Survival alone was enough to validate the gamble, and Columbus understood that timing mattered as much as truth. When he reached Spain, the impact was immediate. News travelled faster than the ships themselves, and anticipation filled ports and courts before he arrived. Columbus presented himself as the discoverer of a new passage to Asia, emphasizing potential rather than limitation. He spoke confidently of islands, resources, and future voyages, allowing imagination to fill the gaps left by incomplete knowledge. The promise mattered more than precision. The court reception elevated him from persistence to prominence almost overnight. Columbus was welcomed not as a petitioner, but as a successful agent of royal ambition. Titles and honours that had once seemed excessive were now justified by possibility. He carefully curated his account, selecting details that aligned with expectations while minimising those that raised questions. Control of the story became as important as control of the ships. Public reaction followed quickly. Displays of unfamiliar people, materials and descriptions of distant lands fueled fascination and pride. Columbus became a symbol of daring rewarded, a figure who had crossed the unknown and returned to speak of it. His name circulated far beyond the court, carried by rumour, celebration, and strategic exaggeration. Fame arrived before understanding, and it arrived fully formed. Yet beneath the acclaim lay unresolved uncertainty. The geography remained vague, the riches speculative, and the route unproven beyond the initial crossing. Columbus dismissed these gaps as temporary, confident that further voyages would complete the picture. Doubt was treated as impatience, not skepticism. Momentum replaced verification, driving decisions forward before questions could slow them. The second voyage began with ambition rather than uncertainty. Columbus no longer sailed to test an idea, but to enforce a conclusion already accepted by the Crown. The expedition was larger, better supplied, and openly imperial in purpose. Ships carried not just sailors, but soldiers, administrators, livestock, and tools meant to transform discovery into control. Exploration had narrowed into execution. Upon arrival, expectations collided with reality. The fragile settlements imagined from Spain met a landscape that resisted order and predictability. Disease, hunger, and unfamiliar climate quickly eroded confidence. Columbus pushed forward regardless, convinced that discipline and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Where adaptability was needed, he relied instead on authority, treating resistance, human or environmental, as defiance rather than warning. Early colonization introduced a new dynamic between Europeans and the indigenous population. What had once been cautious interaction hardened into enforced labor and command. Columbus interpreted cooperation as obligation and began organizing the local population around extraction rather than exchange. Gold, still scarce, became an obsession that shaped policy, punishment, and expectation. The search for wealth intensified pressure on both colonists and natives alike. Leadership during this phase exposed limits that exploration had concealed. Columbus proved capable of endurance and vision, but administration demanded compromise, patience, and flexibility. Internal dissent grew as settlers questioned his decisions and resented harsh discipline. Authority at sea had been absolute. Authority on land fractured under competing interests, scarcity, and fear. The colony struggled not only against external conditions but against its own contradictions. Promises made to the crown required results, yet results could not be forced on command. Columbus responded by tightening control, believing that order imposed from above would stabilize the situation. Instead, tensions deepened, and early colonial structures formed around coercion rather than sustainability. Conflict emerged not as a single rupture, but as a constant condition of colonial life. Scarcity, fear, and unmet promises eroded trust among settlers, while harsh policies deepened resentment among the indigenous population. Columbus governed through command rather than consensus, applying the logic of a ship's deck to a volatile and expanding colony. What had worked at sea now produced instability on land. Misrule became visible in daily administration. Decisions were centralized, punishments severe, and rewards unevenly distributed. Columbus relied heavily on family members to enforce authority, blurring the line between loyalty and competence. Settlers who had expected wealth and status instead found hunger, labor, and rigid discipline. Complaints multiplied, carried by returning ships back to Spain where they accumulated weight and credibility. Relations with the indigenous population deteriorated rapidly. Systems of forced labor replaced early exchanges, justified by the demand for gold and order. Resistance was met with violence, and violence invited further resistance. Columbus interpreted unrest as ingratitude or rebellion, never as a response to exploitation. The colony became trapped in a cycle where control bred instability, and instability demanded harsher control. Within the European community, opposition hardened into open defiance. Some settlers ignored orders, others plotted removal, and many documented grievances with careful detail. Columbus responded by tightening authority further, convinced that leniency would collapse what little order remained. Leadership narrowed into enforcement, and enforcement isolated him from those he governed. Reports reaching Spain painted a troubling picture. Instead of a prosperous extension of royal power, the colony appeared disordered and brutal. Advisors began questioning whether Columbus's talents as a navigator had been mistaken for skills as a governor. The contrast between his celebrated discovery and his troubled administration became impossible to ignore. Later voyages unfolded under the weight of disillusion rather than hope. Columbus returned to the Atlantic no longer as a celebrated pioneer, but as a figure whose authority was questioned and increasingly constrained. The ocean that had once promised transformation now delivered repetition, storms, delays, and land that failed to yield the wealth once imagined. Each journey carried the expectation of redemption, yet offered fewer illusions to sustain it. The realities of empire hardened quickly. Settlements required constant supplies, discipline, and labour, none of which the distant crown could fully provide. Columbus confronted a system that demanded results without granting flexibility. Administration became survival management, and exploration narrowed into crisis control. Expansion no longer felt limitless. It felt expensive, unstable, and morally corrosive. Relations with indigenous communities worsened as imperial pressure increased. Resistance was no longer episodic, but structural, driven by forced labour, disease, and displacement. Columbus responded with severity, believing order could only be preserved through fear. The line between governance and punishment dissolved, and authority became synonymous with coercion. The empire he served advanced, but at the cost of constant unrest. Natural forces added to the strain. Hurricanes destroyed ships, ruined settlements, and erased months of labour in hours. These disasters were not isolated setbacks, but reminders of how fragile control remained. Columbus's confidence, once reinforced by survival at sea, was now tested by an environment that resisted permanence. The land itself refused submission. By his final voyages, Columbus's role had shifted dramatically. Exploration gave way to justification. He searched not for new routes, but for validation of past claims and decisions. Each discovery was framed defensively, meant to prove that earlier promises had not been false. The gap between expectation and outcome narrowed into resentment, both his own and that of those who followed him. The harsh realities of empire stripped away the myth that had carried him westward. What remained was endurance without triumph, and authority without admiration. Columbus had opened a path that others would expand and exploit more efficiently. But his own experience revealed the limits of vision untempered by governance. The ocean had yielded to crossing, but the world beyond it resisted control, exposing empire as a burden as much as a prize. The fall came, not with a single accusation, but with the slow accumulation of failures that could no longer be ignored. Reports from the colonies described disorder, cruelty, and persistent unrest, all pointing back to Columbus's leadership. What had once been tolerated as growing pains was now judged as mismanagement. The Crown, increasingly aware that expansion required stability, decided that distance no longer excused disorder. Royal intervention arrived in the form of authority, stripped of trust. Investigators were sent not to advise, but to replace. Columbus was confronted with the consequences of decisions he had justified as necessary. His explanations, once persuasive, now sounded defensive. The language of destiny and endurance carried little weight against written complaints and witness testimony. Arrest followed with a shock that cut through years of self-assurance. Columbus was taken into custody and returned to Spain in chains, a gesture heavy with symbolism. The man who had crossed the ocean under royal banners now stood as a reminder that service did not guarantee immunity. Power granted could be withdrawn, and titles earned could be questioned. The loss of authority reshaped his identity. Governorships were revoked, privileges suspended, and control handed to others deemed more capable of administration. Columbus protested fiercely, insisting that his actions had been misunderstood and exaggerated. He saw punishment not as judgment, but as betrayal, convinced that the crown had forgotten the risks he alone had taken. Public perception shifted alongside official action. Columbus was no longer presented as the unchallenged architect of expansion, but as a flawed figure whose ambition had outpaced his ability to govern. Praise dimmed, replaced by silence or cautious distance. His name remained known, but its meaning had changed, no longer synonymous with success. The fall from power marked the end of his influence, though not the end of his belief. Columbus never abandoned the conviction that history would vindicate him. Yet the moment revealed a hard truth about empire. Discovery could elevate a man, but administration could undo him. Authority demanded more than vision, and when vision failed to adapt, it collapsed under its own weight. Columbus died far from the applause that had once surrounded his name. The final years of his life unfolded in quiet rooms and strained conversations, marked by illness, financial uncertainty, and persistent grievance. He was not forgotten entirely, but he was no longer central. The court had moved on, occupied with managing an empire that had outgrown its originator. Despite diminished status, Columbus never revised his understanding of what he had achieved. He maintained that he had reached the edges of Asia, clinging to this belief with the same determination that had carried him across the Atlantic. Evidence to the contrary accumulated, but acceptance would have required surrendering the logic that defined his life. For Columbus, correction felt like erasure. Legal battles replaced voyages. He petitioned relentlessly for the restoration of titles, income, and recognition promised in earlier agreements. These efforts consumed his remaining energy, turning legacy into litigation. The language of his appeals was unwavering, asserting rights rather than requesting mercy. Yet the world he addressed had shifted toward pragmatism, less interested in honouring claims than in controlling outcomes. Physically, his body mirrored the strain of his career. Pain, fatigue, and declining mobility confined him, while memories of storms and crossings remained vivid. The sea that had once defined his identity was now distant, accessible only through recollection. Isolation deepened as companions faded and authority receded. When death came, it did not resolve the contradictions of his life. Columbus left behind unanswered questions, rather than settled judgments. He was neither fully celebrated nor fully condemned, occupying an ambiguous space shaped by ambition, endurance, and consequence. The empire that followed him expanded rapidly, often without reference to his intentions or explanations. In obscurity, his unfulfilled beliefs endured as a final testament to his character. Columbus had changed the world without fully understanding it, and he died convinced of a truth history would later revise. His life closed not with clarity, but with persistence, the same force that had driven him westward and had, in the end, carried him beyond his own comprehension. Columbus's legacy exists in tension, shaped by consequences far larger than his intentions. He is remembered as a figure who opened pathways that permanently altered human connection, collapsing distances that had once defined separate worlds. The crossing of the Atlantic did not merely link continents, it redefined the scale of interaction, making global exchange inevitable rather than exceptional. In that sense, his voyages marked a structural turning point in history. Yet, discovery cannot be separated from disruption. The encounters that followed his arrival initiated cycles of conquest, exploitation, and demographic collapse that reshaped entire societies. For indigenous populations, the legacy was not opportunity, but devastation, disease, displacement, and the destruction of social systems, that had endured for centuries. What began as navigation became domination, and the costs of that transformation remain central to any assessment of his impact. Controversy surrounds not only what Columbus did, but how his actions have been remembered. Early narratives emphasized courage and innovation while minimizing suffering. Later, reassessments shifted focus toward power, violence, and responsibility. This tension reflects a broader struggle over how history is told, whether it celebrates expansion or interrogates its price. Columbus stands at the center of that debate, not as an answer, but as a challenge. Globally, the effects of his voyages accelerated processes that reshaped economies, ecologies, and cultures. Crops, animals, ideas, and diseases moved across oceans in both directions, transforming diets, labor systems, and landscapes. These exchanges created wealth and growth in some regions, while amplifying inequality and dependency in others. The modern world emerged from this convergence, uneven and interconnected. Columbus himself became less important than what followed him. Empires expanded with greater efficiency, systems of control hardened, and exploration turned into administration. The world he helped reveal was claimed, divided, and governed by forces that exceeded his influence. His personal beliefs faded, but the mechanisms set in motion continued without pause. Today, his legacy resists simplification. He cannot be reduced to hero or villain without losing the complexity of his impact. Columbus represents the moment when ambition crossed into consequence, when endurance met power, and when belief reshaped reality on a global scale. His name endures not because it resolves history, but because it forces confrontation with how the modern world began, and at what cost.